This week on Dialogue, investigating power. Welcome to the Woodrow Wilson Center in Washington, D.C. I'm John Milewski. Each week, Dialogue explores the world of ideas and issues in international affairs, history, and culture. Our guest this week is Charles Lewis. He's one of the most accomplished investigative reporters of this or any generation. After leaving 60 Minutes, he founded several nonprofit organizations, including the Center for Public Integrity and the Fund for Independence in Journalism. He's currently a professor with the School of Communication at American University, where he also serves as founding executive editor of the Investigative Reporting Workshop. Chuck, welcome to Dialogue. Thanks for joining us.
Nice to be here, John.
I want to start with some definitions.
Sure.
You know, when I think of the term investigative reporting, I'm somewhat more intrigued by what it says about other reporting as much as what it says about investigative reporting, because it would suggest something that's deeper, that takes longer, that involves more diligence, research. But I always wonder, what's the other thing?
Well, I mean, there are dozens of books about investigative reporting, and actually they all have different definitions of what investigative reporting is.
Do you have a favorite, one that you use?
You know, I've just settled in on in-depth journalism. It basically, to me, means anything that's not daily journalism, that is, takes weeks, months, years to dig into. Some people have a narrower definition that it's secret stuff that the government or corporations don't want you to know.
Yeah.
I think the definition needs to be broader than that, because sometimes the subjects are broader. So I think that's too narrow.
So Bill Moyers has promoted that it's everything they don't want you to know is what news is. Everything else is something else.
A lot of it is what they don't want you to know, but sometimes it's things using data that no one's ever seen that even the government doesn't know, or So I like to keep the definition broad. So I would. To me, investigative journalism means in-depth. And in the Pulitzer Prize categories, it's explanatory journalism, public service journalism, investigative journalism. And investigative journalism was not a category in the Pulitzer Prizes until around 1985. The Pulitzers began in 1917. So even in the profession of journalism, there was a debate. Well, everyone does investigative.
Well, that's what I'm wondering about this. The other reporters feel slighted, and what they do is somehow less serious, less important, less.
They did in the 70s and 80s, and I think increasingly that evaporated to some extent. But Woodward and Bernstein, breaking the Watergate scandal, did not see themselves as investigative reporters. They were reporters who did a crime story, and it turned into the biggest political story in the history of the United States. But they tried not to identify themselves that way to this day, actually. So this is it's not a big debate about it, but it is true there are differing definitions.
What is the current level of activity? Are we at a high or low point?
Well, we're at a lower point. The entries for the Pulitzer Prize for public service journalism are down about 40% since the mid-'80s, and investigative journalism category and others are down 20 to 40%. So the membership in investigative reporters and editors, the trade association for all the investigative reporters, has gone from 5,200 down to 4,000. So as we've seen a contraction in newsrooms across America and print journalism, we've lost 1/3 of our reporters in America. Of course, many of those are investigative reporters, I-teams, things like that. So the capacity has been diminished.
Is this type of reporting even more adversely affected by budget cutting because it takes more investment to turn out the stories?
It is. The two most expensive types of journalism in the world are international reporting and investigative reporting. The problem is we don't have any data about what you just asked. I believe the answer to that is yes. Most investigative reporters are the more senior journalists. They've been there longer. It means they're more expensive. They're older. They have X years of experience. And, and so when you're cutting a newsroom in half or a third, you're going to go after the big budget people, and you're going to hire young pups fresh out of college. And that's sort of what's been happening in the last 5, 10, 15 years. So we've lost 1/3 of our print reporters. We've doubled the number of public relations people in America in the same period of time, which brings us into all kinds of other areas. But it's been a difficult time. There's no way to sugarcoat it.
Not enough people left to cut through the spin.
No, not enough at all. There's not enough. There's more spin than we've ever had in the history of the U.S. And in the US, UK, and Australia, and I'm sure many other countries, but I just know data for those three, more than 50% of news stories now are based on press releases. So we are increasingly getting spin that has been repackaged as news. We have fewer reporters covering the White House today than we did under the preceding president and the preceding. So every year we have fewer reporters actually covering things. Most cities in the United States have half as many reporters generally than they did in the 1980s.
Well, what you describe as a news industry allowing itself to just be used as an amplification system for people with a press release.
Wow, that's right. I mean, when you cut your staff to the extent that it's happened here, you're going to have fewer reporters covering more stories, and that automatically means they're not going to be doing in-depth journalism. They're going to be doing multiple stories a day, and it means it's going to be lightweight reporting, and you're going to rely on handouts.
Now, but you live this, and so this is all very current to you. You're seeing it every day. But from the outside looking in, there's something counterintuitive going on here, because it appears that we have more sources of news and information than ever before, accessible in ways that we couldn't even dream of a generation ago. And yet, the infrastructure behind that is doing less actual reporting. Is that what you're telling us?
Yeah, that's right. I mean, in the commercial media, we have a lot of TV shows. We have a lot of, in citizens, we have 300 million websites in the U.S. alone in this country, and so we're in a blizzard of information. It's just that very little of it has been independently researched by people that have professional information gathering techniques where it's steeped and it's been edited by professional editors. You know, everyone's now a journalist. Everyone has got blogs. So we have a big issue now. But what is a journalist? Who is a journalist? And is what I just read true?
How is that different than days when people lived off the wire services to fuel their reporting? Even if they followed up on a story, they didn't do the initial investigating or reporting that unveiled the story. How is it different?
Well, the reason it's different is locally there's fewer people actually doing the news in every community in the United States, without exception. And in Washington we have fewer, many of the bureaus have closed. We have always relied, I mean, journalists have always relied, the public has always relied on news services, but one or two of them have actually collapsed completely. And Associated Press itself is just doing okay, not great. And so, you know, I just think we're at a turning point with the commercial model, what works, what doesn't. Increasingly, Associated Press's clients are companies, not newspapers. And so we're moving into a have and have not situation with information. The rich have all kinds of information they're paying lots of money for, and the public doesn't. They have websites, and they have to figure out what's real and what
blogs.
Isn't.
And we build this as Investigating Power, borrowing the title from your new website. Tell us about that project.
Well, it's a part of a book project I've been on for a long time, 7 or 8 years. I felt I had to go talk to the best investigative reporters around, or the best journalists, the most notable journalists, and I did something very unusual. People have done oral history interviews with important journalists in the past, but what I think is unusual is I looked at contemporary U.S. history and identified moments of truth when U.S. history really may have been affected by the journalism to some extent, where journalists did in-your-face kind of courageous reporting that made the public
And what are
notice.
those? What are those moments?
Well, the McCarthyism period in the early 50s, the Civil Rights era, 1954 to 68, roughly, during the struggle and the marches and the dogs and the hoses and all that stuff. The Vietnam War, obviously, from 62 to 75. You've got the Watergate scandal, of course, sort of stands alone as our biggest constitutional crisis in U.S. history. Post 9/11 America is another one. And then there's one that's not temporal, not tethered to a date, which is what I call corporate power. And I interviewed a number of journalists in that case who tried to investigate the tobacco industry and ran into some resistance, shall we say, internally and otherwise. So I was trying to look at journalists whose reporting changed history. I mean, Murray Martyr and McCarthy, who's 94 years old, stood up to, tracked McCarthy every day for 4 years. The famous Sir, Have You No Sense of Decency hearings came from his newspaper series in the Washington Post. Very few reporters today will have 4 years to look at a single subject. That's the kind of thing we're losing. Woodward and Bernstein covered Watergate for 2.5 years. Their editor overseeing every word they did, and the rest of the newspaper's coverage. Barry Sussman was in charge of Watergate coverage for 1.5 years. That's not typical today.
Are you describing essentially a website that's a tribute to a dying form?
I guess you could say that. I'm hoping.
It's a sort of depressing thought.
I'm as a professor teaching young people and having helped to create nonprofits. There's now 65 nonprofits doing journalism, and I've created a few of these, and so I refuse to acknowledge that it's dying, but this is a crisis. It's been very difficult for several years, and I think we have to find new models and new ways out of it, and I've sort of devoted my career, at least for the last few years, at trying to find a new way. Increasingly, the most important journalism in the U.S. and around the world is going to come from this nonprofit sector, and I'm in up to my ears on that whole MO, trying to do that. But you're right. What we're talking about here is a moment in time, and I did it exactly to be a reminder to the public about the canaries in the mine shaft of democracy. If you don't have someone noticing a trend or a problem or a danger, that would be the reporters. And we need to note that the importance of original reporting. If you don't have original reporting, as Walter Lippmann said, you can't have a government. A government without information, independent information, cannot function. It starts to become a mirage. They start to believe their own press releases. Everyone needs an outside arbiter of information, and that's what reporters have been. You can't have self-governance if the public has no information that's not from the government or not from major corporations or other groups.
We've selected a couple clips from the site, so we'll look at them together and talk about some of the things that are uncovered. The first is Bob Woodward, and this is under the mantle of the art of manipulation. So we'll hear what he says and come back and talk about it.
You mentioned the public relations savvy of this Bush White House. Does it bother you at all as a long-standing investigative reporter and ostensible truth teller that 2/3 of the American people thought Saddam Hussein and Iraq had helped to bring down the World Trade Towers within 6 months to a year after the invasion, when in fact we later find out the whole rationale for war was flawed, to put it charitably? Can you explain to me, where does this White House fit in terms of manipulating information, but also where does the press corps fit in over 30 or 40 years?
They're very good at spinning it, as was the Clinton White House, as have lots of White Houses.
It seems like they've gotten better, though.
Yeah, I think that, you know, they have more people working on it, and the art form is you know, there's certain things you can do, like recommend something that might be critical because people will then think it's favorable. But that's life. But the way I look at it, particularly about weapons of mass destruction, which is a giant issue and should be an issue. Right. I write in State of Denial how the general in charge, General Spider Marks, in his war diary expressed doubts about the existence of WMD, and he was in charge.
Right.
Turns out Rumsfeld himself wrote a memo 5 months before the war, voicing, listing 29 things that might go wrong, and number 13 was, we may not find WMD, weapons of mass destruction, on the ground. So he had doubt. I ran a story in the Post before the war saying there's no smoking gun intelligence on weapons of mass destruction in Iraq. I let that drop. I fault myself mightily for not knowing what that meant. When you don't have smoking gun intelligence, you don't know what you have. You have a lot of circumstantial evidence, which sometimes can be wrong. I should have been much more aggressive in looking at that, just like the CIA and the administration and all kinds of other people should have. But I really get in a hair shirt on this, as I've said, because I was in a position to be more aggressive. As George Tenet former CIA director, says in his book, well, it was implausible that Saddam didn't have weapons of mass destruction. Well, implausibility is not evidence.
You know, Bob Woodward's not the only reporter kicking himself. If mea culpas could balance the federal budget, we'd be in the black. But I wonder, when I listen to this conversation between you and Woodward, there's a government that's better at messaging, right, for lack of a better term. There's a press corps that is somehow underperforming, and there are still debates on why that's the case. And then third, there's us, the consumers of news, the people who aren't involved on that beat. Are we more gullible? When you look at that construct, where do you see the blame lying?
Well, it can be spread around. Bob Woodward is right. The press did drop the ball. Most major news organizations, almost without exception, all three networks, the New York Times, the Washington Post, others, either endorsed the war editorially, but they are also, their reporters had strangely laryngitis, and Woodward's story that he did have was buried in the paper. Another story by Walter Pincus was buried in the paper, and those stories appeared just in the last days when we all knew we were about to invade Iraq. So the press has very low marks, but frankly, I did a 2.5-year investigation with 9 researchers. It was called Iraq, the War Card, and we looked at all the public statements made by the Bush top officials from the president down, and they were saying this, they were all on message, and they were all saying the same thing about weapons of mass destruction for literally 2 full years after 9/11.
The phraseology repeated, like the warning coming in the form of a mushroom cloud. We heard the same
rhetoric. Exactly. And then what happens is the press amplified that. All the press ended up doing was expanding that out. So if 935 statements are made by 8 top officials, that was millions of words in the U.S. alone, not to mention the amplification around the world. The entire world's media covered that. And so we were all in a big, huge echo chamber where we're all hearing the same actually incorrect, false information. It was all untrue. It was a false assumption, and it turned out to be wrong, and we waged a war based on false information.
So if the watchdogs aren't biting, we don't have a fighting chance in that equation.
We don't have any chance. No, it's really serious. That's a case, but we did it again. We did it with Vietnam. The press didn't know that basically we attacked North Vietnam, not the other way around. We find out in the Pentagon Papers in 1971 when they're made public by the New York Times and the Washington Post. But as Ben Bradley, the longtime editor of the Washington Post, said, what would have happened if we'd known the truth in 1964? We might not have had a war in Vietnam. We're talking about significant issues here about truth and what the public knows. I mean, they're about as fundamental to a democracy as we can get, and so that's why this is kind of compelling to me personally.
But what I should also, Chuck, I should also compliment you on the website. It's terrific. And the interviews are terrific as well. I mean, we're going to take a look at another one. This is
a long time, 5 years.
Well, it was worth the wait.
Well,
it was worth the wait. The next clip is with Helen Thomas, and it covers a lot of what we're talking about right here. Let's hear what she has to say.
Sure. You've written about the role of the White House and the press secretaries in relation to the press, and that the best press secretaries were brokers between the journalists trying to get the truth on behalf of the American people and the person in power and the responsibility.
And who believed in the truth, really, who basically had some sense of credibility. It's an impossible job to be press secretary. Right. You wear 2 hats, you really do. I mean, you were a spokesman for the president, for the federal government, for the American people. That's one hat. The other is to try to convey the information through the press, which is a transmission belt.
And so it seems like in the 1980s with Deaver and Reagan and continuing especially to today, something changed. It was no longer, it was less a broker, more and more with each passing year, less a broker and more of an employee of the president putting out the message and not telling you much else besides the message and not helping the press all that much, being adversarial almost. I don't mean to put words in your mouth, but
no.
what happened in the last 5 or 10 years with...
You tell me. The passivity of the American people amid lies, passivity of the press, knowing they were lies and saying nothing. I don't know whether it was the corporate heads playing ball with the White House or whatever, but there definitely was a change in terms of our moral compass.
I still struggle with this notion about what is the responsibility of the individual in this equation. It's easy to identify lies or spin or half-truths or outright propaganda campaigns. But there are reporters, there are people like you and others who are out there fighting the good fight, providing information, and even though it may not be on the front page, it's there, and we don't seem to want to buy it.
Well, yeah, I mean, there is an issue about, that she called it, the passivity of the public itself is a little bit annoying, I have to say, as a citizen.
I think it's a lot annoying.
More than annoying, yeah, more than, roughly, well, actually 2/3 of the public does not vote in most elections, presidentials, and maybe it's 50%. But we have, you know, I know a few years ago, 40% of state legislative races, there were no opponents. 40% of the incumbents had no one running against them. But we have a system where no one really wants to get involved too much in politics or to talk much about it directly. We have a lot of activity on the blog, sure, but that's really the partisans on both sides screaming at each other, or the shout shows on cable. I don't count that. That's most of the public is not as well informed as they should be. Back in the mid-90s, there was a poll: 40% of the country could not name the vice president of the United States. That's pretty serious.
It probably continues to be a minority of people who can name the vice president.
Yeah, no, it's really annoying. Annoying and disturbing and outrageous for the country. We wonder, in a way, the old thing, we get a government that we deserve, you could argue.
Well, one of your guests, Carl Bernstein, we're going to look at the clip where he talks about this triumph of idiot culture, and he attempts to find a moment, maybe not where it happened in an instant, but that it culminated. And so let's take a look at this clip.
That's great. You've talked about in a speech and in one or two articles in The Guardian and The New Republic about how we have created the idiot culture. And there's a great passage here. The lowest form of popular culture: lack of information, misinformation, disinformation, and a contempt for the truth or the reality of most people's lives has overrun real journalism. Today, ordinary Americans are being stuffed with garbage. This was written and said mostly in the 90s.
1992.
92, and
every once in a while you get to be prescient. I don't know what else to say.
Yeah,
I'm quite amazed.
So that's 15 years ago, and it hasn't exactly gotten better.
It's gotten worse, obviously.
What has happened in the last, frankly, the last 3 decades?
It's very complicated, and it can't be separated from the rest of the culture. You can't separate journalistic culture from the rest of popular culture. Journalism, I think that piece says in there, good journalism is popular culture, but it's popular culture that stretches and informs its readers rather than that which descends to the lowest common denominator. I think I've used it in speeches ever since. And I believe that. And I think what has happened is that, look, we always had, we had yellow journalism, you know, but never until around the period when I was writing that piece, did it seem to me that this debasement of mainstream newspapers and broadcasting had occurred. And this was written right around the time of the first hard copy shows on television, the Murdochization of the New York Post. On the day that not just the New York Post and the New York Daily News tabloids, but Newsday, which was then owned by the Los Angeles Times and was probably the best tabloid newspaper in America, did the whole front page this day about the breakup of Donald Trump's first marriage to Ivana Trump and Trump's new relationship with this woman named Marla Maples. And on that same day, the allies of World War II agreed to the reunification of Germany, and Nelson Mandela was released from the South African gulag that he had been in for all those years. And those stories were inside Newsday, the 2 other tabloids here, and many other newspapers in America, and every local news broadcast in this town, television, Mandela and reunification stories, they followed the Trump marriage stories.
Your pained reaction is seemingly the only reasonable reaction to that. We looked at the clip before we began recording, and the crew sat stunned and sighing as you did. It really says a lot, and unfortunately not a lot of good about us. I think of Neil Postman's "Amusing Ourselves to Death."
Exactly, which I think he wrote in the 80s, actually.
Yeah, speaking of being prescient.
But that's a 1992 observation that Bernstein made, and here we are 20 years later, and it's clearly worse. But exactly how you measure it, I don't know. But we're in a really grim situation. And so if you're a reporter, suppose you have a really important story. Imagine how hard it is to get it out, even in your publication. You're going to be blocked because we want to do Marla today, and we're going to. And so that's
the obsession with Trump continues to this day. We only have a minute left,
sure.
and I'm compelled, because we have to get out of bed in the morning, to end on a positive note.
Yeah,
so tell me about where the action is right now today. Is these things that you've been involved in, founding is the word. There is this stuff percolating up from unexpected places.
There is. There are 65 nonprofits trying to do investigative reporting all over the United States. In 2006, there were 5. So there's a growth thing going on that's very, very interesting. There's an investigative news network linking them together, which I helped to start, and there are now 15 to 20 or so nonprofits similarly around the world, outside the U.S., starting up. That's really exciting, and increasingly our most important journalism will be done with the commercial sector, but with the nonprofit sector collaborating, and that's where it's happening at the moment. If our best journalism about the meltdown recently or the Iraq War has actually been in books. That's very, very interesting. And books now, with e-books, we're in such an iteration with e-books, you're going to have video and e-books here pretty soon, if some are maybe starting already. So the technology is getting very interesting. 60% of the world has mobile devices, but you can download link into stuff. And so I actually am optimistic about the future. I have young people that want to rip the rafters down and do investigations, and my job is to make sure this doesn't become hieroglyphics as a teacher. And so I'm really into this, and so let's see what happens. Well, we have no choice. Yes. Otherwise we live in the dark completely.
Well, thank you for continuing fighting the good fight and all these great things you've done, Chuck, and thanks for sharing with us today. Sure. Those of you interested in seeing more of the types of clips we showed you, the website is investigatingpower.org. .org. Yeah. Thanks, Chuck.
Thanks.
We'll return next week with another edition of Dialogue On. Till then, for all of us at the Wilson Center, I'm John Milewski. Thanks for joining us.
We'd like to hear from you. Please send your questions or comments to dialogue@wilsoncenter.org. You can also follow us on Facebook. Search Dialogue Radio and Television. Our host Twitter feed is twitter.com/John Milewski. Dialogue is a co-production of the Woodrow Wilson International Center for Scholars and MHZ Networks. Dialogue is available via broadcast, cable, satellite, and telco on MHZ Worldview throughout the United States. To see how to watch where you live, visit www.mhznetworks.org.